Center for the Study of World Religions, Harvard Divinity School.
This is a lovely collection here of a few cases of psychedelic aesthetics. We have Jacob Green, Alisa Lozhkina, awesome, and Natalie Bloch will join us virtually. Jacob Green, are you ready? All right, super. He'll kick us off here. Jacob is a PhD candidate in history, right? At UCLA, giving us psychedelic god machines, entity encounters under anesthesia in the 19th and 20th centuries.
So just to give you a little of background on my overall research project, people usually associate psychedelics and science with either today or maybe the 1950s. But actually in the 19th century, a lot of the same issues that have come up around psychedelics today actually came up when anesthesia was first discovered. Anesthesia was discovered around the mid-1840s. And you don't usually think of anesthetics as psychedelics, although ketamine is used in therapy a lot these days, but even anesthetics like nitrous oxide and ether can have psychedelic properties. Like they're usually used to make people unconscious in medicine, but sometimes people have hallucinations or mystical experiences or novel thought patterns when they use them. So today I'm going to be talking about one particular aspect of my work, which is entity encounters that people had under anesthesia. So a lot of you probably recognize this gentleman up here if you're more familiar with the popular research on psychedelics, Terence McKenna and his machine elves that he saw on DMT. And he wasn't really the first person to conceptualize the entities he encountered as machines. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And another aspect of my work I'm going to talk about today is bad trips, challenging experiences that people had, and how people in the past used the resources that were available to them to reconceptualize those experiences into spiritually meaningful ones. So first off, talk about set and setting here. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this, but just to give you a little bit of a refresher, set and setting is the idea that your mindset and the environment around you shapes your psychedelic experiences. Psychedelic scientists usually only pay attention to the immediate set and setting around when someone is using a drug. So maybe the room they're in or some kind of intention setting. But historians like Ido Hartogson have actually pointed out that historical context can also play a role in set and setting as well and shape how people are interpreting their experiences just because they're involved in this wider cultural world around them. So what are the important things about set and setting for the 19th century? Well, there are two factors I think that are really important for these entity encounters. One is industrialization. I'm going to be talking about experiences that happened around the turn of the 20th century. And during that time, the Industrial Revolution had already been going on for over 100 years, but the industrialization of society was really getting into high gear. More people were moving to cities, people were working in factories, and new forms of transportation like railroads and steamships had already sort of exploded and taken over the world around them. And one thing about this is that people often use these new ways, these new technologies as ways of understanding the world. So for example, historians have pointed out that European colonizers, when they went to colonize other peoples, would sometimes justify their domination of these other peoples through their technological superiority. They thought they were superior, so they could either dominate these people or had a duty to help these primitive people, quote unquote, whatever, help them get better. Other people conceptualize the human body as a machine, thinking about the nerves as kind of telegraph wires. So industrialization is ever present. It's a lens for understanding reality. And along with that, you have this narrative of progress, which, I would say before World War II, especially before World War I, there's this idea that technology is going to make things get better and better, that technology is going to keep advancing into the future, and basically Western civilization, as it's known, is just going to on this path towards this great destiny, kind of like this rocket-like path. So that's one of the contexts. The other one is the explosion in religious creativity that happened during the 19th century. The 19th century, some people thought, like maybe 50 years ago, that with this rise of technology and science, like Darwinian evolution, that people lost faith. That's actually not the case, people have realized more recently. Some people stopped attending kind of mainline churches, but there are a bunch of other religious movements that arose. Most importantly for my talk today are forms of Christianity where people felt like they could commune with the divine more directly. So these kind of like revival meetings that people would go to. Christian Science is one example of this. The founder, Mary Baker Eddy, had divine revelations from God that form the foundation of Christian Science, and people directly interface with the divine through being healed in Christian Science, but that's only one example of that type of Christianity. And the other is Theosophy, which is this system of knowledge. They didn't call themselves a religion, founded by this Russian woman named Helena Blavatsky, who said that she had encountered these ancient Tibetan figures that transmitted this knowledge tradition to her. It has a lot of elements that are similar to Hinduism, Buddhism, and also Western magical traditions in Jewish Kabbalah. And there were a lot of publications like Light and the Occult Digest that were disseminating these ideas to people. Okay, so that's the context. Now I'm going to talk about two experiences. Actually, the paper that this is based on, there's one more in there, but I don't have time to talk about that. And the chapter that's based on, there's a few more, so I'm happy to talk about those in questions if y'all are interested. But this one, I picked it because it's related to a book that many of you probably know since we're at the Harvard Divinity School, which is William James' Varieties of Religious Experience. It's one of the foundational texts in the psychology of religion. And one thing that people don't often recognize, I'm certainly not the first person to say this, is that James' chapter on mysticism, which is one of the most famous in the book, actually has 3 or 4 psychedelic experiences in there. And they are what form a lot of the foundation for his understanding of mystical experiences. So this one I'm going to talk about today is in a footnote in that chapter. And it was an experience that was sent to James that an anonymous woman had while she was having a surgical procedure. So what happened was this woman went in for surgery, she went under, and she found that she was transported to a different realm, kind of floating in the sky above everything. And when she was there, she encountered God. And this is what she had to say about God. A great being or power was traveling through the sky. His foot was on a kind of lightning, as a wheel is on a rail. It was his pathway. The lightning was made entirely of the spirits of innumerable people close to one another, and I was one of them. So, she's laying here kind of on this railroad track that's made of souls. She sees God coming towards her, and she sees God struggling to change his direction. He's really struggling. He approaches, and then his foot passes over her, and her body explodes in pain. More pain than she's ever experienced in her entire life, she says. However, through that pain, it provided some type of power or some type of motivation that allowed God to change his path and then speed on into the ether. So initially, this sounds like a pretty negative experience, right? Getting crushed under the foot of God, where you experience the worst pain you've ever had in your life. I mean, that's a pretty bad trip, right? I mean, I don't know, that sounds pretty bad to me. But when the woman awoke, she actually had tears in her eyes because she said it was one of the most spiritual, meaningful things that had happened in her life. So how did she manage to integrate this experience, which on the face of it is pretty terrible? Well, for one thing, so, this panel's about aesthetics. So she was confronted with really intense sensory information from this experience. Flashes of lightning from under God's foot, presumably like a whirring sound as he's traveling along these rails, and then this intense pain. And she used the language of modern industrialization to conceptualize this experience. It's kind of like what she reached for here. Because God is like a giant train traveling along a rail of souls. It's like the only way she could really conceptualize God was as the same sorts of giant machines that were in her environment. And I'm arguing that one thing that also might have done is interpolate this narrative of progress I was talking about before. So, industrialization was kind of a messy process. Like working in a factory wasn't pleasant during that time. There were long hours and people often died. There were actually railroad accidents that happened all the time around there as well. But at the same time, people still viewed this technological advancement as a form of progress, like something good that was going towards a goal. So I think that this narrative of progress also came to play a role here, because the woman said that when God changed direction, he was enacting part of his plan. Like she didn't know quite what that plan was, but there was something that God meant to do that was moving the universe forward, and her pain was sort of the motivating force for that. So, in the material world, you have this difficult technological process that's causing a lot of pain but leading towards something. Spiritual world, her pain leading towards something. Also, I think this Christian paradigm of directly encountering God is important here as well. She doesn't talk about Christ, but she does use the word God. So I think it's fair to assume she's operating under this paradigm, or at least it seems pretty likely. So the fact that this was a direct encounter with God also made it a meaningful experience for her. Even though it was something painful, it was a direct interface with the divinity. It wasn't just reading from a hymnal or something like that. So she was able to translate this really difficult experience into an extremely meaningful one. And even though she was left with the idea that this is kind of a brutal truth about the universe, that suffering is something that actually is what enables God to enact his plan in reality, she said it resonated with her a lot. It was one of the most meaningful experiences of her life. Okay, second experience I'm going to talk about here today appeared in Psyche magazine in 1920s. And Psyche was kind of like a magazine that was a mix of like occult stuff and psychology stuff. And this was an article written by a man named Edwin Mortimer Standing, who was an associate of Maria Montessori, who was the founder of the Montessori education system. That's probably what he's best known as. He wrote a book about her. But in any case, one day Standing says that he went to the dentist office and was put under anesthesia. And like the woman that I just talked about, he was transferred to this void, this other universe, where there were all these chaotic sights and sounds that were happening around him that he couldn't quite understand. And the most intense sensation that he felt was actually the presence of this invisible entity kind of floating there with him in the void. Like he couldn't see what this was, but he felt this thing there. And the only way that he could describe it was as a giant machine. So again, here, kind of reaching for the language of industrialization when confronted with this like sensory overload when having an entity encounter. And this is what Standing said happened after he perceived this entity. Someone or something was deliberately getting at me through this machine. And though I did not seem to longer possess a body, because he's floating in this void, was causing the most intense pain. I writhed under the torment and longed to escape, but there was no escape I knew. So here again, Standing is getting crushed in the gears of this giant God machine. There is a little bit of a difference from the previous experience in that the machine eventually lets him go, and he finds himself floating in the void again, and he's just flooded with this really intense, blissful, pleasurable feeling for a second. And the machine grabs hold of it again and starts crushing him with even more intensity, even more intense pain. Then he's released again and feels this bliss. So in the third cycle of this, Standing has a revelation that this experience is sort of a symbolic representation of humanity's path throughout the universe. Essentially, like he felt pain and then joy, and then more intense pain and then more joy. Things kept getting more and more intense, but everything ended in joy. Like the pain always led to joy. So Standing said, actually, the thing that's behind the universe, like the oneness behind the universe, is trying to make a blissful utopia for all humans. But this isn't a free ride. To get there, you have to experience pain. He said, for example, the rack must come before the release. Those upper levels cannot be reached by any primrose path, not any spiritual shortcut. However, joy is greater than suffering, love is stronger than hate, life victorious over death. In the end, joy wins over suffering every time. And at the very end of this experience, Standing encountered what he described as a shining one, kind of like an angelic figure that confirmed that, yes, in fact, this was the message that he was supposed to take out of this experience. Okay, so again, this seems like a bad trip. You're getting crushed in the gears of a giant God machine, right? I mean, that doesn't sound fun. I don't know. Maybe some of you like that, but I feel like that's a little bit tough. But here again, we have this narrative of progress, pain, pleasure, things are progressively getting better from this like kind of material transposed onto spiritual discourse here. But additionally, the editor of Psyche said that Standing's experience was probably influenced by his recent readings in theosophy. He had been reading theosophical texts. And one thing about theosophy is that theosophists believe that in rare cases, spiritual entities like this could contact humans and give them messages like this. And there was also kind of this evolutionary narrative within theosophy itself. Like civilization was this kind of cycle of civilization and collapse and disaster, civilization and collapse and disaster. And at this current time, humans are on a path towards kind of spiritual perfection, which is meant to lead towards merging with the oneness here. So through using this kind of theosophical ideas, this initial experience where he's just kind of like at the whims of this giant machine that's crushing him to death is translating into something that's very meaningful to him. Okay, this is another experience I can't talk about, but anyway, we'll talk about that later. Yeah, I know, that's someone who didn't integrate so well. I can talk about that in questions if you want. But I think that one of the most important things about this for our discussion today is how doctors responded to this in the 19th century. Now, doctors are humans, and a lot of them share the same religious beliefs as other people. So for example, George Wilde was a theosophist who was also a physician, And he and some of his other colleagues believed that these experiences actually empirically showed that there are realms of existence beyond normal human consciousness, like the afterlife and stuff like that. And they thought that anesthesia might be a way to experimentally study these other planes of existence. Most doctors, however, did not feel like that. They thought that these experiences were just an inconvenient side effect of anesthesia. So for example, Standing, the guy I was just talking about, when he awoke, his dentist is like, hey, did you have any fun dreams? And Standing is like, yes, I found out the meaning of the universe. You know, joy is the greatest thing, the kernel of existence that is everything is moving towards. And the dentist kind of said, oh, that's nice. Drink some water and get out of my office. You know, not great. And as you might imagine, Standing didn't really take very well to this. He said, quote, it was born upon me that a prophet is without honor in a dentist's chair. So, I mean, as you can see, like, you know, patients, and this is not the only case, there are other cases I found like this, patients are having these really intense spiritual experiences, but then their providers are basically saying that's meaningless and you're probably gonna forget about it anyway, because anesthetics sometimes cause amnesia. And I think this is an important thing to think about these days, because mystical experiences is not an expected effect of going to the dentist. I would say that's generally not the case, but in psychedelic therapy, under a lot of paradigms that are popular today, it is. People in another talk earlier kind of talked about the inner guiding intelligence that's kind of underlying MAPS. Also, if you look at the Johns Hopkins studies that really kicked off the psychedelic renaissance, this idea of mystical experiences based into them. And a lot of people have criticized that. They've been like, look, you can't interpolate religion into medicine. That's not a good thing. You know, there is some value to that, but I think that these experiences and perhaps others from today show that, you know, religion is a way that some people recode what are potentially negative experiences into things that are really excellent and spiritually meaningful to them. So it makes sense that while you might not enforce some type of religious belief on people, you know, chaplaincy, having chaplains available at least when people undergo psychedelic experiences can be something very important, especially when people have negative experiences. So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jacob. Next we have Alisa Lozhkina from Iron Curtain to Inner Vision, Psychedelics, Spiritual Awakening, and Political Imagination in Ukrainian Art After the Fall of Communism. And Alisa is a PhD candidate in comparative history at Central European University. So let's welcome Alisa.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here today. I'm not a religious scholar. I'm an art curator, an artist, and as I call myself, an existential tourist, because I don't know anymore who we are in this world. So today my talk will be on the topic that is very far from what we explored already, but I hope it enriches your understanding of psychedelics as they function, as they give birth to contemporary art. So I'm from Ukraine, and today you all know Ukraine only from the news about bad things that are happening in our country. But Ukrainian art is more than that, and Ukrainian society is more than that. So we are going back in time to the times of the collapse of the Soviet Union. You are looking at a work by a famous Ukrainian artist, Alexander Roitbard. He painted this piece in 2021, just a few months before his death. To an outsider, it may seem that the painting is indeed about vaccination, which was a widely discussed topic at the time. However, the artwork also has a hidden meaning, evident to members of the Odessa art community in Ukraine, who experienced the psychedelic revolution of the 1990s and early 2000s. For them, this composition was unmistakably associated with intramuscular ketamine injections. Let me tell you an old joke about it. Quote, guys, I'm seeing God. Take it easy, dude. We're all seeing him. This anecdote about the first intramuscular ketamine experience of a naive Odessa gangster tripping alongside his more seasoned companions in 1990s was often retold by young artists of Ukraine's new wave. Seeing God became the unofficial jargon within the art community to describe the psychedelic experiments of the first post-Soviet generation. The collapse of the Soviet Union was a period of immense social turbulence. In the late 1980s and early 90s, the core values of Soviet society underwent dramatic change. The decline of the superpower sparked a wave of artistic and spiritual exploration. In Ukraine, the so-called new wave of artists emerged during and after the Soviet Union's collapse. This generation broke away from the official aesthetic paradigms. In the early 1990s, after Ukraine gained independence, this cohort began exploring new artistic media, living in bohemian squats, organizing the country's first rave parties, and experimenting with mind-altering substances. The contrast between this lifestyle and the conservative norms of Soviet society was staggering. Artists explore all possible methods to expand their consciousness, not only as a form of banal decadence, which is close to everybody's heart, but as a sincere philosophical inquiry. This surge in psychedelic art and spirituality is especially striking in a country transitioning from 7 decades of militant atheism and materialism. Discovery of psychedelic substances in the USSR did not happen overnight. Stanislav Grof, in his book When the Impossible Happens, dedicated a full chapter to his memoirs of bringing LSD to the Soviet Union in the 1960s. I mean, I can only imagine it. Nevertheless, at that stage, the infatuation with mind-altering substances did not go beyond narrow scientific circles. A wider popularity of these substances came in late 1980s when members of cultural underground discovered LSD, PCP, mescaline, and other mind-altering substances. In Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, the epicenter of this artistic movement was the squat on Paris Commune Street, commonly known as Parcom. In 1990-1994, Parcom became a hub for a community of young individuals who not only resided there but also produced art and transformed the squat into the focal point of bohemian life in Ukraine. This environment fostered a vibrant creative space where boundaries of traditional artistic expression were continuously pushed. For the artists of the new wave, video was a fascinating new means of expression. There was no video art in the Soviet Union, there was only Soviet official propaganda, mainly. It's noteworthy that the first video experiment in the new Ukrainian art was inspired by mind-altering substances. The idea of this artwork that you are seeing now, which is called the Curved Mirrors, and it was created in 1992, belonged to Alexander Gnilitsky, who was the key figure of Ukrainian New Wave. The artist bought curved mirrors from the fun house of an abandoned entertainment park. Once he had installed the mirrors in his studio, Gnilitsky invited 2 other artists, his wife Natalia Filonenko and her boyfriend, they were a polycule, Maxim Mamsikom, to play the leading roles in his film. Gnilitsky managed to create a truly unique surrealist effect by filming erotic and pornographic scenes reflected in the curved mirrors. As a result, the video lost its pornographic qualities and visually resembled drug-induced optical distortions. Another central figure of Parcom squat was Oleg Holosy. You can see him on the right in this image. In just a couple of years, in the early 1990s, he created an impressive number of paintings addressing psychedelic themes. This is one of them. Oleg Holosy's most famous artwork is his painting Psychedelic Attack of the Blue Rabbits, this particular one. Following the logic of postmodern citation, the artist copied the famous composition of Russian artist Kuzma Petrov-Vodkin and his canvas In the Line of Fire, created in 1916. The heroes of World War I, as depicted in this classic painting, are replaced with absurdist rabbits with human faces. Psychedelic Attack of the Blue Rabbits is the manifesto of a generation whose front line wasn't advancing through an utterly fake reality, but rather through the territory of expanded consciousness. Petrov-Vodkin's painting depicts a group of soldiers hurling themselves into an attack. One of them is running forward with a weapon in his hands, but the central figure of the composition is another officer who has just been fatally wounded in the heart, even though just seconds before he was leading the charge. You can see him on the left. This attack is clearly his last. As if sensing his own fate and fearing it, Holosy subtly shifts the emphasis of his interpretation of Petrov-Vodkin's work. Nonetheless, the prophetic nature of Psychedelic Attack becomes especially clear when it's compared with the original. On 17th of January in 1993, 27-year-old Oleg Holosy died in an accident during a psychedelic walk around the city. It was in Kiev. Under the influence of PCP, he fell to his death after trying to take flight from a building site in the botanical gardens. Oleg Holosy's death was deeply traumatic for the whole new wave generation, and it drew a symbolic line under the heroic era of the Kiev squads. The euphoria of Parcom faded away, and it's as accurately described by Jean Baudrillard, who was especially trendy at that time, a sense of the world after orgy settled in its place. But around this time, the psychedelic revolution was still in full swing in another major Ukrainian city, Odessa. Here, the spotlight was on ketamine, the post-Soviet art community's favorite substance. I might make a remark here that it was legal till 2005. I mean, you needed a prescription, but it was widely available in stores. During Soviet times, drug use was largely confined to the criminal subculture and was primarily associated with heavy opioids and hemp, which was prevalent in Central Asia. The average Soviet artist was often a chronic alcoholic. Not often, almost always. Ketamine, however, entered the art community through the medical field, and paradoxically, its introduction was initially linked to efforts to combat chronic alcoholism. In the 1970s, morphine was used in the USSR for this purpose, an approach that tragically led to an opioid addiction in one of the most famous musicians and poets of the late Soviet era, Vladimir Vysotsky. Aware of morphine's extreme addictiveness, doctors began searching for alternative methods to treat alcohol dependence. In 1984-85, such an alternative emerged, proposed and practiced by Evgeny Krupitsky, a psychiatrist and addiction specialist from Leningrad, modern-day St. Petersburg. Through Krupitsky's experiments, the Bohemian circles of Leningrad learned about the new drug. News of ketamine and its remarkable properties quickly spread through the numerous horizontal artistic networks in the Soviet Union. In Ukraine, the substance and instructions for its use were brought by an artist, Sergei Anufriev, a key figure in Odessa and Moscow conceptualism. In the early 1990s, Odessa saw the formation of its own circle of the new wave artists, closely connected to the Kiev Parcom. The informal leader of this circle was Alexander Roitburt, an artist, curator, and a guru of an entire generation of creative youth, and a very big psychedelic enthusiast. During Soviet times, the profession of an artist had a rigid caste-like structure. The 1990s brought significant change. The vibrant, punk-like atmosphere and newfound freedom of this era completely redefined the rules of the game. Alexander Roitburt actively invited people from circles far removed from art to participate in his numerous unconventional and dazzling art projects. Psychedelics played an essential role in transforming the artistic environment. They facilitated social mobility. People who were previously outside the art world were now able to access express methods for exploring the fields of imagination. This simplification of entry into contemporary art allowed young people with no prior exposures to aesthetics or the transgressive themes of early 1990s postmodern art to immerse themselves in the art scene. It's no coincidence that within the art community of that time, the first intramuscular injection of ketamine was usually referred to as an initiation. By 1999 and 95, the collective use of psychedelics has grown to such proportions that nearly every after-party following an exhibition opening transformed into a shared flight rather than a typical celebration. In the slang of the artistic crowd, the verb to fly referred specially to the experience of a ketamine trip induced by an intramuscular injection. In 1998, Alexander Roitburt created his renowned video Psychedelic Invasion of the Battleship Potemkin into the tautological hallucinations of Sergei Eisenstein. It's a crazy title, but they were in fashion back in the days. This work became, and I think they were also partially influenced by psychedelic overreactions. In 1998, this work became one of his most celebrated pieces and stand as a key statement on psychedelic aesthetics in contemporary Ukrainian art. Snippets of Sergei Eisenstein film Battleship Potemkin, which you probably heard about, were rearranged by Roitburt and edited together with surrealist film vignettes, which were themed around the classical movie and created with the help of Odessa artists. Roitburt's video almost immediately got international recognition. It was bought by a Museum of Modern Art in New York and then chosen to be a part of the central section of the 2001 Venice Biennale. Here you see another artwork from the same circle in Odessa, which is called Apocalypso. You should understand that one of the types of ketamine that was very common in Odessa and in Ukraine back in the days was made in Hungary under the brand name Calypsol. So the artist basically played in this with words between apocalypsis and calypsol, which was the title of ketamine, and showed this Pinocchio who was diving into this absolutely surreal image and eventually was making an injection into his vein, which was, to be honest, against the logic of calypsol consumption in Ukraine and elsewhere at that time, because it was administered mainly intramuscularly. But it was just for the sake of beauty of the composition. An important artwork from the later periods that exposed psychedelic aesthetics in the political imagination of the post-Soviet era comes from another key artist of the new wave, Kyiv-based painter and photographer Arsen Savadov. His photo series, titled Collective Red 2, made in 1999, originated as a performance intervention during a communist May Day demonstration on Kyiv's European Square. A group of young, handsome male performers dressed in ballet tutus struck bizarre poses in front of the demonstration, transforming it into a backdrop for their personal homoerotic spectacle. By the late 1990s, Ukraine's Communist Party had become a caricature of its former self, a collection of armchair warriors. The youth in ballet tutus demoralize and undermine those former everyday citizens of the USSR. Orgiastic psychedelia parades itself in front of totalitarian seriousness. Old World War II veterans are posing wearing toadstool hats, and it soon becomes clear that everybody in the frame, including the performers, is no more than just a part of an endless bloody red hallucination. Ukrainian New Wave is often criticized for its lack of interest in the political. It is true that activism in Ukrainian art would only begin a decade later. However, the artist's apolitical stance and the psychedelic revolution that the generation of the 1990s lived through could to a certain degree themselves be interpreted as a political position. If artists did indeed engage with political themes, it was more often done at an ironic distance. The negative legacy of the recent past was clearly at play here, where everything political was associated with the overinflation of narratives and the empty images of the propaganda machine in the late Soviet period. We can relate to it now, I think. The fundamental characteristics of this generation were freedom, hedonism, and transgression. Transgression became a natural reaction to the changes happening in a society where the dominant narratives were fundamentally changing. New capitalist values replaced old communist ideals, but the young artists were not particularly interested in or inspired by this process. A mistrust in society was transmuted into a search for new territory that was free from state ideology. As Belgian sociologist Pascal Guillen writes, I'm quoting it, sociologists understand very well that people, groups, and organizations always exist within a society. Exodus is possible through the power of imagination. Or perhaps it is worth using the neologism inodus, coined by Italian artist Michelangelo Pistoletta, since the power of imagination allows us to remain in the physical world while mentally distancing ourselves from it. The psychedelic experiences of 1990s generation in Ukraine can be characterized precisely as inodus, a retreat into the self, into an imaginary space, or even further into the space of altered consciousness. In the 1990s marked a peak of interest in psychedelics within the Ukrainian artistic community. Amid social changes and new challenges, the psychedelic revolution of this period was eventually followed by two major real-life revolutions in the country in 2004 and 2014. Over time, the epoch of introspection and inner exploration gradually declined, giving way to an era of direct political activism. Nevertheless, the 1990s remain a pivotal moment when Ukrainian artists deeply engaged with altered state of consciousness. The fact that the artists of the new wave not only experimented with psychedelics, but also produced a significant body of work addressing these experiences highlights how crucial those explorations were to their creative development. However, this topic has been largely overlooked by Ukrainian art historians. Discussions about mind-altering substances and altered state of consciousness remain taboo, as they are often perceived as risky and even illegal. Strong prejudices against drugs, coupled with the lack of an established scholarly tradition for addressing such controversial subjects, have further marginalized this discourse. Most artists themselves do not publicly discuss their psychedelic experiences to avoid alienating clients and galleries. Despite these challenges, the discovery of psychedelics played a transformative role in shaping new artistic and spiritual landscape in Ukraine following the collapse of the Soviet Union. This makes the subject deserving thorough and nuanced research. Thank you.
Thank you, Alisa. Next, we have joining us virtually, so we'll have a little transition here to get Natalie on the screen, is Natalie Bloch, who is a research fellow in Hebrew Bible exegesis at Lund University in Sweden. And Natalie will be presenting The Psychedelic Temple, Reimagining Ancient Jewish Temple Space Through Psychedelic Aesthetics.
Hello everyone. I'm joining you from Stockholm, Sweden, where it's late at night and it's a snowstorm outside. So I so wish that I could have been there with you today, but I'm 8 months pregnant, so the long journey from Stockholm to Boston would have been quite rough at this stage. So I'm deeply grateful to you, Jeffrey Bro and Paul Gillis-Smith, for allowing me to present in digital format. In this talk, I will examine how Jewish temple spaces function as transhistorical discursive arenas, idealized geographies, and transcendental portals from a psychedelic perspective. So put yourself in the sandals of ancient Israelites. Imagine being led through the wilderness by a pillar of cloud, or, like Ezekiel, standing at a Babylonian riverbank as a celestial chariot descends from the sky. In an instant, you find yourself transported on a guided tour through a visionary temple. Or step into the white holy vestments of the high priest on Yom Kippur and lock yourself up within the swirling incense of the Holy of Holies, awaiting an encounter with the divine. For millennia, Jewish interpreters and mystics have accessed these narratives through hermeneutical techniques that transforms text, rituals, and imagery into spaces. At the heart of Judaism lies a call to reenact mystic history, to collapse temporal boundaries through exegetical engagement and embodied ritual performance. Though the Jerusalem temple's physical structure is long lost, its symbolic presence endures, offering a transhistorical corridor into mythic space. Across history, Jews have entered temple spaces through different forms of engagement. So the key themes that we will explore here today: how does the legacy of temple traditions intersect with contemporary psychedelic experience? We will talk about the construction of a Jewish psychedelic historical narrative, Jewish psychedelic engagement with temple spaces in historical context, and the reimagining of temple traditions through psychedelic aesthetics, tapping into the transcendental experiences of a psychedelic body. By tracing those themes, we will uncover how Jewish traditions of temple space are finding new expressions within a psychedelic framework. Since the late 1950s and early 1960s, Jewish psychedelic spirituality has emerged as a novel way of engaging with Jewish traditions. The first wave of Jewish psychedelic exploration unfolded in the post-Holocaust era as American Jews sought new spiritual modalities amid a changing cultural landscape. A key figure in this movement was Salman Shachte Shalomi, a former Lubavitch rabbi and one of the founders of the Jewish Renewal Movement, which fused Hasidic traditions with countercultural influences. In 1966, Shachte Shalomi described how LSD allowed him to see Judaism in a new and amazing light, inspiring a reformulation of Jewish beliefs and practices. His work, alongside other pioneers of the Jewish counterculture, laid the foundation for contemporary Jewish psychedelic engagement. So today, a growing number of Jewish organizations, rabbis, scholars, artists, spiritual seekers across the Jewish spectrum are exploring psychedelics through the lens of traditional texts, lore, and mystical traditions. This rapidly expanding movement encompasses diverse forms of engagement, seeking to cultivate spiritual meaning and renew religious practice. In 2021, the journalist Madison Margolin coined the term Judaism's psychedelic renaissance to describe this second wave of Jewish psychedelic engagement. Her book, Exile and Ecstasy, examines how young Jews in the US and in Israel are rekindling spirituality within existing Jewish traditions, often experiencing them through psychedelics. And new organizations such as Shefa, for example, founded in 2020 by Rabbi Zach Kamenetz, provide spaces for integrating Jewish spiritual traditions with psychedelic exploration. So, can psychedelics be traced to the genesis of Judaism? Some Jewish psychedelic practitioners construct historical narratives suggesting that the presence of psychoactive substances in biblical Judaism. And while speculative, these theories frequently appear in contemporary Jewish psychedelic discourse. One hypothesis comes from Benny Shannon, a professor of psychology at the Hebrew University, who I learned recently passed away just a few weeks ago, so may his memory be for a blessing. Shannon proposed that the Israelites may have brewed an ayahuasca-like potion using acacia bark and Syrian rye, both containing DMT. He argued that Moses' encounters, such as the burning bush or the theophany at Sinai, exhibit psychedelic-like patterns. And Don Merker, an author, suggested that manna, described in Exodus, contained ergot, a psychoactive fungus linked to LSD, and he associated it with the bread of the presence, lechem panim, in the tabernacle and in the first temple. Rick Strassman, pioneer in the modern psychedelic research, draws direct parallels between Ezekiel's throne chariot visions and DMT-induced experiences. He highlights similarities: a rush of wind, auditory phenomena, dizziness, and visions of speaking creatures amid flashing colors. Strassman suggests that spontaneous or divinely facilitated DMT released in the brains of prophets like Moses and Ezekiel may have played a role in their revelations. Other theories frame Jewish traditions within shamanic paradigms. The independent researcher Danny Nemu likens Moses' divine guidance to shamanic leadership, interpreting the pillar of cloud as an agent of divinatory ritual, possibly involving entheogens. And Rabbi Harry Rosenberg is often quoted, and he argues that psychoactive smoke inhalation is at the very core of Jewish religion. He takes the Yom Kippur ritual in the temple as an example, when the high priest enters the Holy of Holies, waiting at a space filled with smoke from the blended incense burning on acacia coals containing DMT. And recent archaeological discoveries have further fueled speculation. A shrine at Tel Arad, 8th century BCE, provides the earliest evidence for cannabis use in the ancient Near East, dating to the era of the Solomonic Temple. However, many scholars remain skeptical, emphasizing the need for stronger evidence to link psychedelic to ancient Jewish practice. In 2023, the Center for the Study of World Religions, this fine institution, hosted a panel discussion titled, "Are Psychedelics Theologically Significant for Judaism?" The scholar Sam Shankoff argued that modern claims about Moses and Ezekiel tripping are shaped by contemporary imagination. He suggests that these interpretations may be indicative of forgotten ancestral techniques that did not necessarily rely on psychedelics. And Melila Hellner-Eshed shifts focus from psychedelic substances to expanded states of consciousness in Jewish tradition, framing Moses' visionary encounters, such as the burning bush, as foundational to Jewish collective consciousness and a structured framework for articulating encounters with the divine. So in recent years, mainstream Jewish psychedelic discourse has distanced itself from theories of a psychedelic biblical past. In Exile and Ecstasy, Madison Margolin moves beyond historical speculation, and she argues instead that Judaism itself is inherently psychedelic. She writes, "Psychedelics are revolutionizing Jewish culture, reigniting our spiritual fire, helping us to realize that even without added substance, Judaism itself is an expression of and a container for altered states. In other words, Judaism is psychedelic." And similarly, J. Michelson expresses skepticism, noting the absence of direct references to psychedelic or shamanic traditions in primary sources. So ancient Jewish literature meticulously detailed temple architecture and rituals, shaping Jewish engagement with sacred spaces for millennia. So now I'm going to highlight 3 recurring functions of temple space. It's a discursive arena for reimagining and challenging social and religious structures. It is a way to construct an idealized geography. It is a transcendental portal facilitating encounters with divine presence. So scholarly literature with a spatial gaze have mapped these themes. For example, Mark George argues that the tabernacle encodes Israelite social identity, reflecting how societies impose meaning onto space. And the late anthropologist Mary Douglas takes the spatial reading of the tabernacle further, suggesting that the book of Leviticus mirrors the tabernacle structure, offering exiled Israelites a virtual pilgrimage through sacred geography. Sarah Hart describes the tabernacle as a word image, engaging the senses to create an immersive sacred experience, inviting the recipient to enter a virtual world that becomes a reality within the recipient. During the Babylonian exile, Ezekiel's temple provided displaced Judeans with an alternative temple space in a templeless world. Jonathan C. Smith argues that Ezekiel constructs a coherent ideology of place that aims to map the social configurations of an ideal cultic place. Stephen Twell calls Ezekiel's temple vision a verbal icon, allowing exiles to experience divine presence despite their physical displacement. Susan Nidich likens Ezekiel's vision to a Tibetan Buddhist mandala, a symbolic representation of the sacred cosmos. By encoding temple space within narrative, Ezekiel provides a model for spiritual transcendence. Further engagement with the Ezekielian temple tradition is transmitted through the Heichalot literature, which is a genre of Jewish esoteric texts, focusing on ascent of the mystics through the seven heavens and heavenly palaces and temples. Further, while the second temple still stood in Jerusalem, the temple scroll, that is part of the Dead Sea Scroll material, envisioned an idealized temple as a polemical critique of the temple's existing order and leadership. So as temple imaginaries, these traditions do not stand alone, but in a system of meaning, and in that sense, they enable people with Jewish literacy, Jewish temple literacy, to participate in those spaces across the ages. So the key, I would argue, to imaginary temple premises is found in the fabric of religious tradition. Jewish psychedelic aesthetics, as defined here, represent a mode of perception and spirituality shaped by psychedelic experiences, expanding consciousness to reinterpret Jewish temple traditions. This space-producing hermeneutical practice situates the psychedelic experience within historical and ritual dimensions of sacred spaces. In Cannabis Hasidis, the author Joseph Needleman fuses Hasidic, rabbinic, and Rastafarian thought in a stream of consciousness memoir. He recounts a rooftop party in Jerusalem where participants danced like psychedelic chimps, as police ignored complaints due to Jerusalem Day celebrations. Needleman interprets this as the state being on the side of the partygoers. He writes, Jerusalem, as I understand it, messianically, should be a sacred party city. That's what the temple is for. There should be quiet, meditative places and, more centrally, eternal fires burning in bodies of undying youths, jumping for the stars. These things are what Jerusalem is for, the only way to justify the bad things we do to keep it. So Needleman's radical cultic geography thus constitutes both a critique of the current social order and a utopian vision for an idealized Jerusalem temple. The late Rabbi Joel David Bakst links the pineal gland, a gland in the brain, to the Jerusalem temple and its mythical foundation stone, which in the Mishnah is portrayed as an ancient rock serving as the foundation on which the Ark of the Covenant was placed in the Holy of Holiest in the first temple. The foundation stone is now housed in or close to the dome of the rock. Bakst introduces an esoteric technique which implies a stimulating of the pineal gland to release DMT that, in his opinion, will affect the foundation stone and change the geopolitical conditions on the Temple Mount. So rather than physically reclaiming the Temple Mount, Bakst envisions a collective esoteric effort to implode the foundation stone from within, unleashing a transformative spiritual energy that dissolves divisions and inaugurates a redemptive era, unleashing a universal messianic consciousness that, in his words, would bring peace to Jerusalem. So here, Bakst blurs the boundaries between traditional sacred space and the body. In this vision, Jerusalem's temple is an embodied esoteric geography that is accessible through the release of endogenous DMT in the pineal gland. And in 1960s, Shachta Shalomi, after taking LSD with Timothy Leary, interpreted his psychedelic experience through Aliyat HaNeshama, soul ascent, and Heichalot literature that I mentioned earlier. He described it as flying in a cockpit through a cloud. By incorporating psychedelic experiences into this existing mystical framework, Shachta Shalomi interpreted them as part of a larger Jewish mystical geography. So whether these geographies are accessed through vertical movement up to heavenly temples or horizontal flow through the imaginaries of temple domains, the movement inside the psychedelic body and consciousness is inevitable. Madison Margolin writes, "Indeed, there is the innermost chamber of the temple, and then there is the innermost chamber of ourselves, the metaphysical home of our own internal divinity, which psychedelics can help us access." For the psychedelic body, whether physically positioned in 6th century BCE Babylonia or in 21st century Boston, the temple can be a hermeneutical vehicle, or if you will, a chariot or a cockpit that enables an entering into mythic temple space, demonstrating that the temple, indeed, is an altered state of mind. So some conclusions to end with. When it comes to the construction of a Jewish psychedelic narrative, there are two perspectives. One that actively constructs this historical narrative by seeking evidence in the Hebrew Bible, for example, and the other takes a more skeptical approach, emphasizing more Jewish models of mystical states and altered consciousness. Biblical theophanies provide interpretative frameworks for altered states, aligning psychedelic experiences with long-standing mystical and theological traditions. And when it comes to Jewish engagement with temple space in historical contextualization, we see that historically the temple has served multiple roles: a discursive arena for reimagining social and religious structures, a way to construct an idealized geography, and a transcendental portal facilitating encounters with divine presence. And contemporary Jewish psychedelic practitioners sometimes tap into these ancient approaches. When it comes to spatial reimagining of temple traditions through psychedelic aesthetics, I want to mention that Jewish psychedelic engagement with temple traditions shifts sacred space from physicality to spiritual consciousness. And some reinterpretations envision the temple beyond historical and political constraints, presenting it as a participatory, sensory, and esoteric phenomenon, a dynamic concept that critiques worldly structures while serving as a vehicle for transcendence. Psychedelic temple imaginaries blur the boundaries between historical narratives and embodied experiences. And there I want to thank you for your attention.
cswr.hds.harvard.edu, copyright 2025, the President and Fellows of Harvard College.